Girl runs out of school. Bathroom to janitor. He sees what the principal did and takes action. The sound of the school bell echoed through the hallway, signaling the end of class. The students rushed out, chatting and laughing, eager for lunch. But in the dimly lit bathroom near the back of the school, one girl wasn't smiling. Emma stood in front of the mirror, her hands shaking as she adjusted her glasses. Something wasn't right. She felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Her heart raced, her mind running through the events of the last few minutes. The encounter with the principal still lingered in her mind, filling her with a sense of dread. She thought she had just come in here for a quick break before heading back to class. But the way Principal Thompson had spoken to her in the hallway, something was off. His stern voice, the way his eyes didn't match the forced smile on his face. It was enough to make her uneasy. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept creeping back. Then, moments after she entered the bathroom, she heard the heavy footsteps behind her. Emma's heart pounded harder. She had seen Principal Thompson step in just before the door closed behind her. She had tried to ignore it, hoping he had come in by mistake. But then, the silence, the feeling that she wasn't alone anymore, sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at the door behind her through the mirror. Her hand trembled as she turned off the faucet, her breath quickening. Without warning, Emma bolted toward the door, her mind racing with fear. She pushed it open and ran down the hallway. Her shoes echoed against the cold floor, but she didn't stop. Her first instinct was to find someone, anyone who could help. And that's when she saw him, Mr. Jacob, the janitor, pushing his cleaning cart down the hall. Emma rushed up to him, nearly stumbling as she did. "Mr. Jacob!" she cried, her voice barely holding steady. "You have to help me. The principal. Her words came out in fragments, but the urgency in her voice was clear. Mr. Jacob stopped, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he looked down at the terrified girl standing before him. "What happened, Emma?" he asked, bending down slightly to meet her eyes, his voice calm but firm. He had worked at this school for years, and though he mostly kept to himself, he had seen enough to know when something wasn't right. Emma couldn't bring herself to say the words. She wasn't sure if she even understood what had just happened. All she knew was that she needed to get out of that bathroom. Now standing in front of Mr. Jacob, she felt a slight sense of safety. But the fear hadn't left her. Mr. Jacob glanced over Emma's shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Principal Thompson walking out of the bathroom. His usual calm demeanor replaced with something darker, something unsettling. He didn't say a word, but nodded slightly as he walked past them, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But Mr. Jacob knew better. He had seen enough strange things in this school to know when something wasn't right. And this, whatever had just happened, was definitely not right. "Stay here," Mr. Jacob said softly to Emma, his voice steady but laced with tension. He stood up, keeping an eye on the principal as he made his way down the hall. Something in his gut told him to act, and to act quickly. He wasn't just the janitor. He was a father, a protector at heart, and he couldn't ignore the fear in Emma's eyes. As the principal disappeared around the corner, Mr. Jacob turned back to Emma. "You're safe now. Just breathe," he said, his voice gentle. "But I need you to tell me what happened." Emma hesitated for a moment, biting her lip. She wasn't sure how much to say. Would anyone believe her? Would she get in trouble for speaking out? The school's principal had always been seen as a figure of authority, someone no one questioned. But something about his behavior had crossed a line today. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. I felt scared. He followed me in, and I don't know why. But it didn't feel right, Mr. Jacob. Mr. Jacob's face hardened. He didn't need to hear more to understand. He'd heard rumors over the years, whispers from students, and even some of the teachers, but no one had ever come forward. He had never had solid proof, but now he wasn't going to let this slide. "All right, Emma," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to trust me. I'm going to handle this. You go straight to the office and wait for me there, okay? Don't talk to anyone else. Just wait for me." Emma nodded, though her legs still felt shaky. She trusted Mr. Jacob. He had always been kind to the students, even when no one else seemed to notice. She turned and walked slowly toward the office, glancing back one last time at the janitor. As he stared down the empty hallway, his fists clenched tightly by his sides. As soon as Emma was out of sight, Mr. Jacob set his cleaning supple. He knew confronting the principal head-on wouldn't be enough. This was bigger than just a conversation. The school had to know, the authorities had to know, and most importantly, the students had to be safe. He took a deep breath and started down the hallway toward the principal's office, determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deep it went. But just as he reached the corner where the principal had disappeared, Mr. Jacob heard something that stopped him in his tracks. The unmistakable sound of the principal's voice, low and menacing, coming from behind a nearby door. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to send a chill down his spine. Something was happening, and whatever it wasn't good. As he leaned in closer to listen, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a shadowy figure on the other side. Mr. Jacob froze, realizing that this was far more dangerous than he had imagined, and that's when everything changed. Mr. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, his pulse quickening. The door that had just creaked open seemed to be hiding more than just shadows. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, but he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling gripping his chest. He had promised Emma he would protect her, and something was telling him that this wasn't the first time something had gone wrong inside these walls. He peered into the narrow gap of the door, but what he saw made his stomach churn. There, inside the dimly lit room, was Principal Thompson, speaking to someone on the phone. His tone was low, his words quiet, but every so often a certain phrase would stand out. Handled quietly. No one can know. The principal's voice was cold, calculating, and it was clear that whatever he was discussing, it wasn't innocent. Mr. Jacob pressed his ear closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. It was becoming clear that the principal wasn't just following Emma out of concern. There was something more going on, something darker, and now Mr. Jacob had stumbled right into it. Suddenly, the door creaked louder, and Principal Thompson paused mid-sentence. Mr. Jacob's heart leaped into his throat as he realized he had been caught. He quickly backed away, trying to appear nonchalant, but it was too late. The principal swung the door open, his face flushed with surprise and suspicion. "Mr. Jacob," Principal Thompson said slowly, his voice tight. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be cleaning the halls?" Mr. Jacob forced a calm expression, wiping his hands on his cleaning rag. "I was just making sure the area was clear. Some students left a mess in the hallway. Thought I'd check in," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, he knew he was standing on dangerous ground. The principal eyed him for a moment, his gaze sharp and calculating. "I see," he muttered, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "Well, I think it's best if you stick to your duties, Mr. Jacob. Leave the other matters to me." Mr. Jacob nodded, though he felt his anger rising. It was clear that Principal Thompson wasn't going to let him get close to the truth. And whatever was going on, it involved more than just Emma's fear. The principal seemed to be hiding something much bigger, something Mr. Jacob had barely scratched the surface of. As Mr. Jacob slowly backed away, he caught sight of a small folder on the table just inside the office. His eyes flicked toward it quickly, but he didn't have time to focus on what it might contain. The principal's eyes were still locked on him, watching every move. He had to play it safe. For now, once he was out of the office, Mr. Jacob exhaled, his mind spinning with questions. What was in that folder? And more importantly, who was Principal Thompson talking to? He had heard enough to know that whatever was going on, it was far from normal. And the worst part was, Emma wasn't the only student in danger. As Mr. Jacob walked down the hall, his mind flashed back to the rumors he had heard over the years. There had always been whispers about students feeling uncomfortable around the principal. Some had mentioned strange encounters, while others spoke of unusual meetings behind closed doors. But no one had ever come forward. Fear and authority had kept them silent, and now, it seemed, the truth was starting to crack through the surface. Emma was waiting in the office, her face pale and tense. She looked up at Mr. Jacob with wide eyes, the fear still fresh in her expression. "Did you find out anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Jacob sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. "I don't know what's going on yet, but something isn't right, Emma. I think there's more to this than just you. We need to be careful." Emma nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. She had always felt like an outsider at school, like no one was truly looking out for her. But now, with the principal's strange behavior, she felt more vulnerable than ever. "Do you think the other students know?" she asked, her voice small. "What if this has happened before?" Mr. Jacob's stomach tightened. He hadn't wanted to think about that possibility, but now it seemed unavoidable. If Principal Thompson had been doing this for years, then who else had been affected? How many other students had run into similar situations, but stayed silent out of fear? "Listen, Emma," Mr. Jacob said gently, leaning in closer. "I'm going to keep an eye on him, but we need to find out if there are others. If this has happened to anyone else, we need to know. That's the only way we can stop it." Emma bit her lip, fear mixing with a glimmer of determination. She didn't want to be afraid anymore. "There might be someone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A girl in my grade, Leah. She always seemed nervous around the principal, and she stopped coming to school for a while. I overheard some kids saying it was because of him, but no one ever talked about it." Mr. Jacob's heart sank. He had a sinking feeling that Emma had just uncovered the key to something much bigger than they could have imagined. Leah's absence, the rumors. It was all starting to fall into place, but before they could take action, the office door swung open, and Principal Thompson stepped inside, his face calm but his eyes hard. He looked from Emma to Mr. Jacob, the air thick with tension. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice laced with something darker than concern. Mr. Jacob stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the principal was watching them closely now, and one wrong move could put both him and Emma in danger. But he wasn't backing down. "Not now. We're fine," Mr. Jacob replied, meeting the principal's gaze. "Just making sure Emma is okay." The principal smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Good. I'd hate for any unnecessary concerns to arise." As he walked past them, the tension only grew stronger. Mr. Jacob knew they were running out of time. They needed to get to the bottom of this, and fast, before things spiraled even further out of control. Mr. Jacob's pulse raced. As Principal Thompson disappeared around the corner, he knew time was running out, and if they didn't act now, they might lose any chance of uncovering the truth. Emma, still sitting beside him, looked scared, but determined. She had come to him for help, and now there was no turning back. "We need to talk to Leah," Mr. Jacobs said in a low voice, glancing at the office door to make sure the principal wasn't listening. "If she knows something, we have to hear it from her." Emma nodded, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. "But what if he finds out? What if he tries to stop us?" Mr. Jacob understood her fear, but he couldn't let it paralyze them. "We'll be careful," he assured her. "You're not alone in this, Emma. We'll figure it out together." Later that afternoon, Mr. Jacob made a quiet plan to find Leah. He didn't want to raise any suspicion, so he waited until the halls were empty and he could slip out unnoticed. Emma had given him Leah's address, and while it wasn't far from the school, the walk felt like it took forever. His mind raced with possibilities, but he tried to stay calm, knowing the situation was delicate. When he arrived at Leah's house, he knocked gently on the door. A few moments later, a tired-looking woman opened it, and it was clear from her expression that she wasn't expecting visitors. "Can I help you?" she asked warily. Mr. Jacob introduced himself, explaining that he worked at the school and that he was concerned about Leah. Her mother hesitated for a moment, then sighed, stepping aside to let him in. Leah sat on the couch, her eyes dull and her shoulders slumped. She looked like a shadow of the lively girl she once was. When she saw Mr. Jacob, she glanced away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Leah," Mr. Jacob began softly, sitting across from her. "I'm not here to push you, but Emma told me you might know something about Principal Thompson. Something that happened before." Leah didn't say anything at first. She bit her lip, clearly struggling with something deep inside. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. He did the same thing to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He started following me, acting like he was trying to help, but it didn't feel right. He would call me into his office for meetings that didn't make sense. And when I tried to talk to someone, no one listened." Her voice cracked, and she wiped at her eyes, fighting back tears. "That's why I stopped going to school. I didn't feel safe." Mr. Jacob's heart sank. Hearing Leah's story confirmed everything he feared. The principal had been targeting vulnerable students for who knows how long, and the administration had ignored it. But now, with Leah and Emma speaking up, there was finally proof. "We need to tell someone," Mr. Jacob said gently. "The school board, the police. This can't keep happening." Leah nodded again, her hands trembling. "But will they believe me? They never did before. They'll believe us now," Mr. Jacob said firmly. "We won't let him get away with this." With Leah on board, Mr. Jacob and Emma gathered as much information as they could. Leah shared more details about her experience, and Emma helped gather the courage to report what had happened to her. Together, they compiled everything, enough to make sure Principal Thompson couldn't wriggle his way out of it this time. The next day, Mr. Jacob called the school board and set up a meeting with the authorities. Emma and Leah came along, their voices shaking but determined. They told their stories with Mr. Jacob standing by their side, vouching for them, making sure they felt heard. Principal Thompson was called in, and for the first time, he wasn't in control. The school board listened carefully as the girls spoke, and as more details surfaced, the weight of the truth became undeniable. The principal tried to defend himself, his smile faltering under the pressure, but it was clear his actions had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. By the end of the meeting, Principal Thompson was suspended, pending a full investigation, and the school board promised to take immediate action to protect the students. It was a small victory, but an important one. The truth had come out, and the girls had taken back their power. In the following weeks, the atmosphere at school changed. Word spread quickly about the principal's suspension, And while there were whispers and rumors, there was also a sense of relief. Students who had once stayed silent began to share their stories. No longer afraid of being dismissed, Mr. Jacob continued his work, but he became more than just the janitor. He became someone the students trusted, someone they could come to when they needed help. Emma and Leah, though still healing from their experiences, found strength in each other. They realized that they weren't alone, that their voices mattered, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, can make all the difference. As the school year went on, changes were made to ensure the safety of every student. New policies were put in place, and the administration became more transparent. But the most important change was the one that happened within the students themselves. They learned that they had the power to speak up, to protect each other, and to make a difference. For Mr. Jacob, the whole experience reminded him of the importance of listening, really listening, to those around you. You never know who might be carrying a burden in silence, waiting for someone to believe them. And in the end, it wasn't just about taking action. It was about showing compassion and standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. The story of Emma, Leah, and Mr. Jacob left a lasting impact, not only on the school, but on everyone who heard it. The lesson was clear. No matter how small you feel, your voice can create change. And when people stand together, they can bring light to even the darkest corners.